So, today I'm going to talk about the first half of Edgedancer, the first 10 chapters or so. I've decided to split up Edgedancer just because I realized I have a fair amount of things I want to talk about already, and whatever is going to happen in the end is probably going to give me more to talk about. And also just, I want to get back to the format that I'm used to, with these. With a lot of the Arcanum Unbounded stuff, I've only done sort of I've done videos where I talked about an entire story, and while I certainly enjoyed that, I do want to sort of keep the spirit of this channel alive. So I am splitting Edgedancer in two. So before I get to the actual stuff that happens in the story here, I want to talk about Chris's comments about Roshar that are written before Edgedancer begins. Um, so there's several things here that we learn. So first of all, Chris refers to Spren as splinters. So I'm guessing that means that all Spren actually. No, I was going to say that all Spren come from Honor, because Honor is the only shard of cell that we know has been splintered. But I feel like we have confirmation from Windle that he's attached to cultivation instead. So I'm still not sure how that works. Can you have splinters of a still living and existing shard? I guess you can, because the Lord Ruler called himself a splinter, and I guess he kind of was. I don't know. I don't know what the exact rules for the term splinter are in the Cosmere yet, so I'm just noting that the Spren apparently are splinters. Uh, Also, there are, as I've already known previously from an earlier Chris segment, there are two other inhabited planets in Roshar's system. They are Ashen and Braze. Ashen, which has a bit of a dumb name in my opinion, considering it's a burning planet, apparently has actual humans on it, and those humans live in floating cities. I'm really interested to see if we ever get more of that, because that sounds insane. That sounds like a really interesting thing to just throw out there about this world, that like right next to it there's another fully inhabited planet that sounds even more fantastical and bizarre than Roshar. So Ashen I find very interesting. Braze, the frozen planet, is inhabited by almost exclusively by Spren. And also, I think Chris says that there might also be some cognitive shadows. So ghosts, basically. Um, so Braze, I'm interested in both, but I'm way more interested in Ashen. I'm way more interested in seeing humans living on a planet that sounds incredibly inhospitable. Um, Not much to say there. They've just been acknowledged, and I want to say that I find that very compelling as a concept. The other thing we learn about Roshar is that Roshar's gravity is just 0.7 standard Cosmere gravity. I'm going to assume that standard Cosmere gravity means Earth gravity. So Roshar has weaker gravity than Earth. And I don't think I've necessarily seen that reflected in the actual story yet. But it might be, because it does appear that a lot of stuff on Roshar, like a lot of powers that we've established, like people fly a lot, is what I'm trying to say. Like, obviously Cal can fly now. I mean, basically fly. Seth could fly. Um, but also, Shardplate lets you climb and jump a lot in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think make sense. Um, Lift finds it fairly easy to just climb up walls using Windle. And these things are all like, they're not. I don't find them I don't find them impossible, on a planet with Earth gravity, but knowing that there's actually like significantly reduced gravity on Roshar actually makes them more plausible and seem less fantastical uh, in my mind. The third thing that's mentioned here is that Chris says, "Be aware that this system is the current habitation of the shard of odium on the physical and cognitive realms." So that means that there's like a whole spiritual dimension to odium that we aren't aware of yet, and that apparently isn't on Roshar. I'm not sure what's going on there. Oh, and also she mentions that the Rishadium are nearly sapient, though they're not just, and they're not just naturally occurring super intelligent horses. They're nearly sapient because of a spren bond. So that's interesting. Apparently, animals also have spren bonds. Yeah, that's it for the Chris segment. Let's talk about Lift and Windle. So pretty consistently throughout the Stormlight Archive, the most compelling character relationships, in my opinion, have been between Surge Binders and their Spren. So Cal and Syl, Shallan and Pattern, and now Lift and Windle. These tend to be the most developed relationships, I feel, which makes sense because these are generally the characters who are always together. Like you almost never see Cal without Syl or Shallan without Pattern or Lift without Windle. So it makes sense that these relationships have the most time to develop because there's no time apart. Windle in particular is a very amusing character. I really like his interactions with Lift and the way they play off each other. I read Windle's dialogue in my head in like, well, I sort of alternate between two voices. I'm not sure which I like most. I either read him as like a really long-suffering, tired English butler, kind of like an Alfred Pennyworth character, or I read him as the narrator from the Stanley Parable when he's being a bit more sarcastic. Um, it's a character archetype that I really like. There's not so far a ton of depth to Windle himself, the way there is to Syl and Pattern, but there's a ton of depth to Lift, and Windle plays off that really well. So he works. I don't feel like I'm missing depth from this character. I feel like he works fantastically as something for Lift to play off of. And Lift, and also the fact that Windle gardened chairs in the cognitive realm is a fantastic little detail. I absolutely love that. I love all these little tidbits about how weird, like, the life of Spren in the cognitive realm is. It's really nice. As for Lift, I have already said when I read the original Lift chapter in Words of Radiance that I really like the character archetype that Lift represents, and I stand by that. I think she is a fantastic example of that archetype. And Brandon is doing a fantastic job writing that archetype. So I am naturally inclined to enjoy Lift more than most other characters. But there is also a ton of depth to Lift that is already evident from these 10 short chapters. Lift, there's clearly a lot that's going on in Lift's backstory, and I know that one of the future Stormlight books, like one of the main books, is going to focus on Lift and give us her backstory. I think I read that. So I'm not expecting to get a ton of Lift backstory here because I know it's being saved for later. But we are already getting these glimpses into what drives her, and we also do already know, which is interesting, we do know what she asked of the Night Watcher. she asked the Night Watcher to not change. She is afraid of changing. She wants to be to stay as she is, to stay a child and to stay sort of fluid in terms of her sense of self, her identity, her place in the world. She wants to keep being malleable and plastic and able to become whatever she wants at a moment's notice. And that requires that she doesn't permanently change and become something else. Um, which is really interesting. It's like this interesting tension where what she is actually terrified of is becoming fixed in a specific role, which sounds like what she's terrified of is the lack of change. Like, she wants to keep changing. Like, that's what she actually wants. But the way she phrased her desire to the Night Watcher is that she doesn't want to ever change. Because what she doesn't want to change is her quality of being always changing, if that makes sense. It's an interesting word puzzle, I guess, that's going on there with Lift's relationship to the concept of change and constancy. Now, this next part, this is something that I want to make clear up front. I don't think, in fact, I'm willing to put money that Brandon Sanderson is not going for this. This is not going to happen. This is not going to become canon. However, it is a reading of Lift that occurred to me fairly early on here in Edgedancer. So, I think there is room in this story, in the way that Lift is written, for a really compelling reading of Lift as a trans character. Specifically, a trans boy. The reason I say this is because in one of the earlier chapters here, I think actually the first chapter, there is the implication that recently Lift got her first period. I believe Windle, like, Lift is very upset about something, and Windle says something along the lines of, "Oh, is this about what happened to you? I don't know much about human biology, but as far as I know, that was normal." And then Lift thinks about how she's not supposed to change. The world is supposed to change around her, but she's not. And that to me seems like a fairly clear indication that what happened is that she got her period and ergo entered puberty, and she realizes that she's growing up and changing. And that all makes sense with the version of Lift we're given in the story, but I think it would also work as a potential trans reading of this character. A character who is terrified not necessarily of growing up, but specifically of growing up into womanhood, into the wrong gender, as it were. And I feel like that also suits some of the stuff she says later. For example, she says she hated dreams. They either showed her a life she couldn't have, or a life that terrified her. What was the good of either one? That, to me, sounds a lot like stuff I've heard trans people say about their thought processes in their youth and stuff like that, about fantasizing about being the quote-unquote opposite sex, and stuff like that. Again, that's not what Brandon is going for. I can tell what he's going for, and that's going to be an interesting story on its own. I'm just saying that there is absolutely room here for a very queer transgender reading of Lift as a character. And I'm kind of curious now if people have done that. I'm curious if that's like a thing in the fandom. Because I do know that like the Cosmere does have queer and trans fans, and I'm curious if Lift is a character that people have latched onto, because to me that was like immediately the reading I got once I read the part where it implies she got her period and the part about dreams that I just read to you. So yeah, that's sort of my not really headcanon for Lift, because it's not something I think is true, and I don't think going forward it's going to continue being as easy to read it that way, because I'm sure Lift is going to become more fleshed out in different ways. But it is sort of a reading I think is interesting, and you could probably do a lot with that. And I'm now sort of wondering how whether you could make a more interesting story, perhaps, if Lift was trans. Um, Certainly, all the pieces are there for that reading. Anyway, moving on from that, the actual main plot of this is Lift is essentially hunting darkness, or Nalan, as we now know he actually is. And I really like the dynamic within Lift where she has to keep telling herself that she is hunting Nalan for these silly, childish reasons. That she's doing it to steal his breakfast. She's doing it just to spite him. She's doing it. She's accidentally in this town. She didn't even mean to be in the same town as him. When in reality, it's really obvious that she's doing it because she feels a responsibility to stop him and to help others like herself, who might be his victims. Um, it's one of my favorite elements of the particular kind of character that Lift is, like the whole like thief with a heart of gold archetype. I really like when characters have this like internal thing where like I'm a good person, but my own perception of myself doesn't allow me to be a good person, so I have to justify doing good by making it seem that it's actually for selfish reasons. I really like that, and I really enjoy that element of Lift. Even though it's not, in her case, it's not justifying it necessarily as being for selfish reasons, it's justifying it as being for juvenile reasons. Because what she finds important about herself is that she's a child, she doesn't take things seriously, and so doing something as serious as hunting a murderous god just doesn't fit in with her self perception. And so she has to explain it away to herself in other ways, which I find really compelling. Um, we do get some more details from Nolan himself uh, as to what he and the Skybreakers are actually about. Um, so one of his apprentices asks him, "Why are we killing the Surge Binders? Isn't it good for there to be more Surge Binders? Can't we, like, help them refound the Knights Radiant and all that?" And Nalan says, "Unfortunately, no. I once thought as you, but Ishar made the truth clear to me. If the bonds between men and Spren are reignited, then men will naturally discover the greater power of the oaths. Without honor to regulate this, there is a small chance that what comes next will allow the Voidbringers to again make the jump between worlds. That would cause a desolation, and even a small chance that the world will be destroyed is a risk that we cannot take." So, there's a couple of interesting things here. First, um, there's the implication that um, there being Surge Binders is somehow going to bring back the Voidbringers, which I find very confusing. Because from what we saw in the previous book, assuming that Seth and other characters are correct, and that the storm form Parshendi are the Voidbringers, they returned completely for reasons completely unrelated to the reappearance of the Knights Radiant. So either everyone is wrong about what a Voidbringer is, and there's still some new kind of monstrosity or creature that is yet to be revealed, or this assumption that the return of the Knights Radiant also means the return of the Voidbringers is just wrong, because I don't see a causal link. And the other thing that's interesting here is Ishar. So there's another herald, at least one other herald in addition to Nalan and Talanel, who is just still around, I guess. And Ishar, I believe, is the Lightweaver's herald, because I believe Talanel referred to Shallan as one of Ishar's knights in the previous book. So Ishar is around. Ishar seems to agree with Nalan, and more interestingly, Nalan just obeys Ishar without question, because Nalan says absolute fidelity to the mission Ishar gave us is required. So Nalan, so the heralds aren't necessarily at odds with each other. They have their own hierarchy, and Nalan views Ishar as someone he should just listen to without question. Which is interesting, because I would have assumed that Nalan would be at odds with all of the other heralds, because I would have assumed that Ishar, for example, would want his own order of Knights Radiant to be reformed. But apparently he doesn't, because he appears to have sent Nalan on a mission to kill all non-Skybreakers, basically. And the other important thing that we learn from this conversation is that the heralds, or at least these two heralds, Ishar and Nalan, don't seem to know that Odium is back and doing messed up stuff again. Like, they seem convinced that they can still stop this from happening as though it hasn't already happened. And we know it has happened, because that's what the last book was about. And Seth keeps trying to make Nalan see the truth, and Nalan just keeps refusing to. He just keeps saying, "This is a coincidence. This didn't happen. That doesn't mean anything," and stuff like that. Which is really interesting, because you'd think a herald would be a bit more willing to entertain the idea that that the desolations are back, but apparently not. Okay, so this was a bit of a shorter video than usual, which makes sense. It was only half of this novella, but I do think I'm done for now. I can talk about a lot about the way Lift as a character is written, and the way her thoughts are written, her thought processes work, and the way she phrases things. And I'm going to talk about that in the second part, because I'm sure by then I will have more thoughts on it, and more examples of it. So, see you next week for the end of Edgedancer, and then the week after that for the start of Oathbringer. Yeah, that was that. Bye.